Linda Lansen and Barbara Graham. 41-year-old Linda Lansen was a photographer from New York and a mother to her 7-year-old daughter. She had moved from New York to Tampa, Florida, where she was living with her niece, Linda. On the evening of July 10, 1983, she left her apartment for unknown reasons, but she never returned home. On July 11, 1983, her body was found by a jogger. She was partially clothed and was found in the bushes off a dead-end road with a gunshot wound to the head. The next day, her car was found abandoned on a residential street about 10 miles from where her body was found. Not long after this, her purse was found on the side of a road in Clearwater, Florida, a city about 20 miles outside of Tampa. 1 month later, in August of 1983, 19-year-old Barbara Graham was walking home from her job at the mall, but she never made it back. Her body was discovered on the 19th. She had been dumped behind a dentist's office in the Tampa Heights area. Police's first suspect in Barbara's case was a man named Robert Du Bois. He was 18 years old at the time of the murders, and a resident of the area passed his name on to police, saying that he caused problems in the neighborhood. Du Bois was questioned by police, and he agreed to let them take a dental mold to compare to a bite mark that was found on Barbara's cheek. The 2 bite marks were determined to be a match by forensic odontologist named Dr. Richard Souvenron, and he was charged and convicted for Barbara's murder. Dr. Souvenron gained notoriety just a decade earlier for his work on the Ted Bundy case, where he provided testimony about the bite marks found on Bundy's victims. Robert was initially sentenced to death, but in 1988, his sentence was reduced to life in prison plus 15 years. Robert denied any involvement in the murder and got in contact with the Innocence Project to help him fight this conviction. They were able to use DNA taken from Barbara after her body was found to compare to Robert's DNA, and it didn't match. Robert was exonerated and determined to be wrongfully convicted after spending 37 years in prison for Barbara's murder. It was later revealed that the mold taken of Robert's teeth was made using beeswax, which isn't an acceptable medium for dental molds. Additionally, Dr. Souvenron claimed that the suspect would have a missing front tooth or a gap between his teeth, 2 characteristics that Robert didn't have. To make matters worse, a separate dentist later examined Barbara's wound and determined that it was not even a bite mark at all. After this, the district attorney did some more investigating to determine who was actually responsible for Barbara's death. After doing some DNA testing, the DA realized that it was not 1, but 2 men responsible for Barbara's murder, and that they were also responsible for many more crimes in the Tampa area in the 80s. DNA matches proved that 58-year-old Amos Robinson and 57-year-old Abron Scott were found to be responsible for the deaths of both Barbara Graham and Linda Lansen. Both of them are already serving life sentences for other unrelated murders, those of Herminia Castro and Carlos Orellana, which happened within months of Linda and Barbara's. Since he's been in prison, Robinson has killed 2 other inmates and is serving 3 life sentences for first and second-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Scott is serving 1 life sentence for first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and burglary. Lindy Sue Biechler. Lindy Sue Little was born on January 31, 1956, to her parents Eleanor Giese and Wayne Little. Her parents separated when she was very young, but she lived with her mother Eleanor while her father Wayne remarried and had another child, Mike Little. Lindy was described as a free spirit by her half-brother Mark, and he said that she had a great work ethic. Later in her high school years, Lindy was working at a flower shop and ended up meeting a man named Philip Biechler, who attended Millersville State College and worked for Hertz Rental Cars. Lindy and Philip ended up getting married in 1975 and moving into an apartment, 104A, in the Spring Manor apartment complex in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Not long after they moved into the apartment, Lindy began telling her friends and family that she had an uneasy feeling, like she was being watched and followed. One day, Lindy was home alone when she noticed a man looking through the sliding glass door in her apartment. Ever since this incident, Lindy was nervous to be home alone, especially at night. However, she got off work when it was still light out, while her new husband, Philip, worked later into the evening, leaving Lindy home alone for a few hours, some in the darkness. On December 5th, 1975, Lindy got off work, visited Philip at his job, and then went to the Millersville shopping center to get some groceries. At around 7:15 p.m., she arrived at home and unloaded her groceries. She was supposed to be home alone for the rest of the night, but her family knew that made her uncomfortable. So her Uncle Mel and Aunt Celeste invited her to join them at a basketball game they were taking their kids to that night. At around 8:45 p.m., Mel and Celeste arrived at the apartment to pick up Lindy, and Celeste went up to the front door to get her. Celeste noticed that the front door was unlocked, which she found to be unusual. But as she entered the home, she found more things that weren't quite right. She found a lamp knocked over in the living room and couldn't find Lindy anywhere, even though she was calling her name. Once Celeste made it to the kitchen, she found a horrible scene. Lindy was laying on her back, dead. Celeste called 911, and police arrived soon after. They began investigating the crime scene and couldn't find anything of value missing from the home, so the motive of robbery was quickly ruled out. There was also no evidence that the crime was sexually motivated, and there were no signs of forced entry into the home. There was evidence that Lindy had fought back desperately against her attacker, and police found a male's bloody footprint in the kitchen. According to the autopsy, Lindy had been stabbed with 2 different knives. The butcher knife, which was used, came from her kitchen, but the other knife has never been found, and police assumed that the killer brought it in himself. The medical examiner believed that the fatal stab occurred early on in the attack, but that the killer kept stabbing her in a fit of passion. Lindy's neighbors all had alibis for the time of her murder, so they were all ruled out as suspects, but that also meant that none of them had any leads or information to give police. By February 7th, police had interviewed at least 250 people, but they were no closer to having any solid suspects, leads, or motives. Around the 1-year anniversary of Lindy's death, her parents went to visit her gravesite when they found that her headstone had been vandalized. It was covered in red paint, and it had been chipped and carved into. It was the only gravestone in the cemetery that had been vandalized, so police believed that the incident was related to her murder. Though they investigated the incident, nothing came from it. A few weeks later, police received a 2-page anonymous letter marked urgent. The letter was written in 2 parts. The first from someone who claimed to be the killer, and the second from someone named Janice Crum, who claimed to be a friend of the killer. Police did find someone by the name of Janice Crum who lived in the area, but she was never able to be linked to the crime. FBI profiler James Fitzgerald examined the letter and believed that Lindy's killer had an explosive temper and had major life changes after the crime, such as his life seeming to fall apart or becoming more devoted to his job or religion. He believed that the letter was sent to mislead the police or distract them from any leads they were currently following, and that it was written by one person, not 2. He believed that the author was left-handed and either a female or a male who was struggling with his sexual orientation. He also noted that it's unlikely that the killer was the author of the letter, but that he couldn't rule out that the author was somehow involved in the murder. The letter was eventually lost by police before any physical evidence could be taken from it. In 1982, police investigated the next suspect, mass murderer Gerald Eugene Stano. That year, he was arrested in Florida and confessed to killing nearly 40 women. His father lived near Lancaster, Pennsylvania at the time of Lindy's murder, but no leads came when police circulated Stano's picture around the area. Later that year, he was officially ruled out as a suspect. In 1984, the district attorney's office hired 2 psychics to help on the case. According to the psychics, Lindy's killer had an olive complexion with dark hair and dark eyes and a tattoo on his arm. Investigators believe this man may be Mark Capolupo. At the time of Lindy's murder, he would have been 18 years old, and he'd previously been convicted of other violent crimes. He was shot and killed during a prison escape attempt in 1976, and he was ruled out of Lindy's murder as he was confirmed to be working at the time. Without any more leads, Lindy's case went cold until 2006, when it caught the attention of Vidocq Society, a volunteer group of retired professionals in forensic-related fields that aims to put new eyes on cold cases. In 2019, the case seemed to get a bit closer to being solved. DNA found at the crime scene was used to create a snapshot picture of what the killer may have looked like at ages 25 and 65. It was determined that the killer's ethnicity was Southern European, possibly mixed with Middle Eastern, and that he had dark hair and hazel eyes. Just this year, an arrest was finally made. 68-year-old David Sinopoli was arrested and charged with the murder after DNA found on Lindsay's clothes was sent to Parabon Nanolabs for genealogical testing. Investigators at Parabon identified Sinopoli as a suspect and gave his information to police, who then looked into him more. They found out that he had, at one point, lived in the same apartment complex that Lindy did at the time of her murder. Police were able to extract a sample of David's DNA from a coffee cup he threw away, and when they tested it against the DNA found at the crime scene, a match was made. Even though a DNA match was made, David is currently still being held without bond, awaiting a conviction. Christine McWHORTER and Beatrice Daniels. In January 2009, 22-year-old Christine McWHORTER and her 31-year-old aunt, Beatrice Daniels, were living in the Chestnut Terrace housing complex in Huntingdon County, Pennsylvania, with Christine's 4-month-old daughter and 4-year-old son. Christine had recently moved to the area to escape the violence and crime in Philadelphia, and she was attending college where she studied business. The night of January 2nd, the women were laying in bed with the children between them when they were both shot in the heads and killed with a .25 caliber gun. Luckily, Christine's children were left unharmed after the attack, and it was actually Christine's 4-year-old son who left the apartment to alert neighbors and get help. Investigators collected blood samples from the stairs and doors inside the apartment and found DNA that belonged to an unidentified male. In 2016, the DNA was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, who created an image of what the killer may look like based on his DNA. According to this profile, the killer was a black man with green or hazel eyes and a light to medium skin tone. In 2018, the DNA was used to conduct genetic genealogy, and a man named Mauricio Johnson was identified as a potential suspect. He also matched the physical description released by Parabon. His name was handed over to police, who found out that Christine knew Mauricio's then-girlfriend, Cynthia Swan. In 2019, Mauricio was interviewed by police in his home, where he admitted to knowing Christine and Beatrice through his girlfriend Cynthia, but he denied knowing anything about their murders or even stepping foot in their apartment. Mauricio did give police a sample of DNA, and it was sent off to the state lab in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania by late 2019. While they waited for the results to come back, investigators retrieved Mauricio's time card information from his then employer, the New York Department of Corrections. His time cards revealed that he was not at work at the time of the murders. He did not work on January 2nd, and his shift on January 3rd didn't begin until 7 a.m., plus his place of work was nearly 5 hours away from Christine and Beatrice's apartment. By January 2020, the lab came back saying that the DNA sample given by Mauricio's matched the DNA from the blood found at the crime scene. Police then interviewed Mauricio's half-brother, Carroll Johnson Jr., who believed that their late father had owned a .25 caliber gun, the same kind used to kill the women, and that Morrico inherited his belongings in 1998 after his death. They also interviewed Cynthia Swan, Morrico's ex-girlfriend. The last incoming text on Christine's phone before she died was from Cynthia. She was asking Christine to call her, but Christine never responded. When police interviewed her, she stated that she and Christine were supposed to leave on January 1st to go on a weekend trip, but that they decided to stay home at the last minute so that Cynthia could be with a man named Benjamin June. According to Cynthia, around this time Morrico found out that she was having an affair with Benjamin. Police also interviewed Robert Sheen Spade, the father of Christine's oldest child. Robert told police that he had visited Christine, Beatrice, and the kids on the night of the murders. According to him, the women kept the apartment very clean, and he didn't notice any blood the night he was over. May of 2022, after using DNA to definitively link him to the blood at the crime scene, Morrico was finally arrested and charged with the murders of Beatrice and Christine. He will appear in court in the following months. Renee Cuevas and Shannon LLOYD. In 1987, 23-year-old Shannon LLOYD was living in a home she rented in Garden Grove, California. Her loved ones say she had an adventurous spirit and she was considered to be a tomboy who loved horses. On May 21st, however, she will be found dead in her bathroom after being sexually assaulted and strangled to death, and her murder will go unsolved for decades. Renee Cuevas was a 27-year-old mother who lived not far from Shannon. Her family members said that her son was her pride and joy and that she loved him unconditionally. But on the morning of February 19, 1989, her body was found on Lambert Road in Irvine, California, by El Toro Marine Base. Not much else was released by police regarding her murder. Both Shannon and Renee's murders went unsolved for years. The next development didn't come until 2003, when authorities entered the DNA from Shannon's killer into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. This brought back a match to Renee's killer, letting investigators know that the same person had committed both crimes, but they still had no way of identifying who the suspect was. It wasn't until 18 years later, in 2021, that the Orange County District Attorney's investigative genetic genealogy team was finally able to name a suspect in Renee and Shannon's murders. Reuben J. Smith was born in Michigan but was living in Orange County, California in the 1980s. In 1998, he was arrested in Las Vegas after he sexually assaulted and attempted to kill a woman. After this arrest, he was required to submit a DNA sample to authorities, putting him in the database. This year, in 2022, investigators were able to compare the samples and definitively match the DNA found at Renee and Shannon's crime scenes to Reuben Smith. Smith died by suicide after he shot himself in July of 1999 at the age of 39, before he could ever even face justice for the attack on the third, unidentified woman. Investigators believe that he may be involved in other crimes and are actively looking into this possibility. Nadine Madger. In January of 1980, 25-year-old Nadine Madger was living with her 28-year-old husband Mark, who owned a local auto body shop, and 8-month-old son Daniel in an apartment in Willoughby, Ohio. On the afternoon of January 11th, neighbors who lived in the Madger's apartment complex reported hearing a man screaming. When they looked to see where the screams were coming from, they saw Mark running out of the apartment holding his baby. He frantically handed Daniel to one neighbor, begging her to look after the baby until he can get in contact with the relative to take care of him. He told this neighbor that he had just returned home from work and found his wife dead on their kitchen floor. Willoughby police arrived at the scene just before 5 p.m. After some more investigation, it seemed that Nadine had been stabbed in her head, neck, and torso. Luckily, baby Dan had been left unharmed, and he was found in his playpen just feet away from Nadine's body. Investigators suspected that the attack happened sometime between 1:15 and 4:45 p.m. There was no sign of forced entry into the apartment, and there was no evidence that the murder was sexually motivated. However, it did appear that Nadine put up a fight against her attacker, as chunks of the offender's skin were found under her fingernails and collected as evidence. Additionally, the only thing missing from the home was the knife used in the murder, which came from the kitchen, so police didn't believe that robbery was a motive either. There was blood found on Nadine's shirt that belonged to an unidentified male, and some of it was in perpendicular drops. This told investigators that the suspect was standing above Nadine's body while he was bleeding. One of Nadine's neighbors witnessed a bright yellow Dodge Dart car parked behind the apartment building around the time she would have been killed. They didn't recognize the car as belonging to anyone in the complex, and they hadn't seen it parked there before. Investigators tried to follow this lead, but it ultimately led nowhere. Nadine's husband Mark was soon ruled out as well. Not only did he pass a polygraph test, but he also had a solid alibi. He was at work all day. Nadine's case went cold until 2015, when police received a new lead from the DNA sample found on Nadine's shirt. The Lake County Crime Lab, Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and Lake County Prosecutor's Office teamed up with Parabon Nanolabs to use genetic genealogy to identify Nadine's killer. They found a potential match in a man named Stephen Joseph Simcak. Investigators then took the DNA sample from the crime scene and compared it against a sample from one of Simcak's children, and a match was found. Simcak was a former Marine who lived in Ohio with his wife and children at the time of Nadine's murder. Those who knew him in the 80s told investigators that he owned a yellow Dodge Dart at the time. Police looked into Simcak's time cards from his 37-year career at Lincoln Electric in Lucid, Ohio, only about 10 miles from Willoughby, where Nadine lived. In 1980, Simcak only missed one day of work, January 11th, the day of Nadine's death. He was scheduled to work the second shift that day, but called in sick. In 2002, Simcak retired and moved to Bemis Point, New York, near Buffalo. In 2018, at age 79, Stephen Simcak passed away, leaving behind his wife, 3 biological children, and 2 stepchildren. Investigators are still unsure what a motive might be, as Mark, Nadine's then husband, does not believe that Simcak knew Nadine. Police still encourage anyone with more information on this to come forward. Antonio and Luz Rodriguez. In 2005, 80-year-old Antonio Rodriguez and his 77-year-old wife Luz were living in Cleveland, Texas. Cleveland is a small town that was known to be relatively safe and free of crime, averaging only 1 murder per year, and only a small percentage of their murders go unsolved. Antonio Zamora Rodriguez was born on August 8, 1924. In 1943, when he was 19 years old, he enlisted in the United States Army to fight in World War II. His wife, Maria de la Luz Rodriguez, was born on September 20, 1927, and she was described as a selfless woman who would do anything for anyone. The two of them opened a grocery store when Antonio returned to Texas. The couple had 10 children and were known to be extremely generous to everyone in their community. Antonio and Luz ran a small but popular Mexican food restaurant out of their home for decades. The restaurant became a staple in Cleveland, and members of the community highly respected the couple. In the early 1990s, the couple decided to retire so they could spend more time with their family, especially their grandchildren. By the early 2000s, the Rodriguez's children checked in on their parents a lot as they were getting older and began experiencing some mild medical concerns. At this time, Carolina, the couple's youngest daughter, was checking in on her parents up to 3 times a day, every day. In 2004, one of Antonio and Luz's grandsons, Bernardino, was killed. Bernie, as he was called by loved ones, was described as his grandparents' baby, and his murder was especially hard for them. He was only 30 years old at the time of his death, and he had 2 young children. On October 29th, 2 men allegedly struck Bernardino repeatedly with a hammer and an axe over what was considered to be a grudge. Bernardino's body was left in the men's home for 2 days, and during those 2 days, the men went to Walmart to purchase a tarp, duct tape, and cleaning supplies to hide his body and clean up the crime scene. They then buried him in a rural area in a shallow grave. By November 2nd, 2004, his body was recovered, and just days later, his killers were arrested. Antonio and Luz, however, wouldn't live to see justice served for their grandson. On the morning of April 14th, 2005, Antonio went to a local convenience store to buy some scratch-off lottery tickets, something he and Luz did regularly since their retirement. Shortly after he returned home, their daughter Carolina stopped by to check on them. While they visited, Antonio scratched off one of his tickets. At around 10 a.m., Carolina left to pick up something from the funeral home that handled Bernardino's services before heading 25 miles south to visit her sister Norma's restaurant and pick up lunch for her parents. She arrived back at their home shortly after 12 p.m. and immediately noticed that neither of them had gotten the mail from the mailbox yet, which was something her father normally did every day before lunchtime. She thought they had potentially fallen asleep, especially when she didn't get a response when she entered the home and called their names. She continued walking through the house and eventually found them in their bedroom, but they were not asleep. Carolina found her father's body on the floor in the hallway outside the bedroom, with blood running down his forehead. When she entered the bedroom, she found her mother's body in the bed. She had serious bruising on the side of her head, and both of them appeared to have been beaten in their heads and faces with a blunt object. It would be revealed later on that their causes of death were a combination of both the beatings and strangulation. Strangely, it seemed that the killer had placed Luz in the bed and tucked her in. At 12:45 p.m., Carolina called the police to report her parents' deaths. The investigation began immediately, and the police who arrived at the scene called for all of the department's detectives to join them on site. Investigators began by using scent tracking dogs. The dogs tracked the suspect's scent across some railroad tracks to an apartment complex, but no further than that. 2 persons of interest were taken into custody at the apartment complex, but they were released by the end of the day. Police collected surveillance footage from the convenience store where Antonio purchased the lottery tickets, but it didn't give up much information. According to detectives, they did fingerprints at the crime scene. They don't match any family member's fingerprints, and they were located on an object that the killer undoubtedly touched, according to the detectives. In addition to the fingerprints, there was also blood from an unknown suspect found on a rug in the home. A sample was taken and entered in the CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but there were no matches. After these failed attempts at getting leads, the case went cold for years. It wasn't until March of 2021, when investigators re-entered the sample into CODIS, that a match was found. The DNA belonged to a now 41-year-old woman named Shelley Susan Thompson Limon, who was already serving a prison sentence in Texas for unrelated drug and property offenses. When police questioned Shelley, she told them she had no knowledge of the Rodriguez family or the deaths. They took a sample of her DNA to compare to the sample from the crime scene, and a match was made. On July 8, 2022, Shelley was arrested outside her parole office and charged with capital murder for the deaths of Antonio and Luz Rodriguez. The Rodriguez's daughter, Carolina, said that she never seen or heard of Shelley Thompson Limon, and she didn't know of any connection between Shelley and her parents. She also believes there's a chance that Shelley didn't work alone and that other people were involved in her parents' murders. According to Antonio and Luz's children, their community never stopped supporting them and praying for a resolution in the case. Thank you for sticking around to the end of this episode. If you'd like to know more about cold cases which were solved this year, check out this playlist.